Well, I think our time is up. So hello, everybody. So welcome to the lecture series on frontier issues in health communication, hosted by Peking University School of Journalism and Communication. And this week, we're extremely honored to have a world-renowned scholar, Professor Himelboim, as our guest speaker. I believe that many of our audiences have already very familiar with Dr. Himelboim's and his research, which has been very impactful, especially in the fields of health communication, political communication, and emerging communication technologies, and computational communication. But still, I would like to briefly introduce Dr. Himelboim to our audience today. So Itai Himelboim is an associate professor of advertising, Thomas C. Dalton Professor of Media Analytics, and founder and director of the SEE Suite, Social Media Engagement and Evaluation Lab at the University of Georgia. And his research interests include computational approaches to social media analytics and network analysis of large social media data, with focus on advertising, politics, and health. And in his research, Dr. Himelboim examines the network structures that emerge when users exchange information on Twitter and other social media spaces, patterns of information diffusion, the emergence of network clusters as information echo chambers, and key information sources, as well as identifying key users and content that bridges information silos. Dr. Himelboim has been my role model since I was a graduate student in the United States, and I was also honored to have co-published a paper with Dr. Itai Himelboim recently on New Media and Society that was a computational content analysis of Twitter discussions regarding COVID conspiracy theories. And I was very fortunate, and through that collaboration process, I was deeply impressed by Dr. Himelboim's great ideas and his working style, and I have benefited a lot through that collaboration. And Dr. Himelboim's work has been very cutting edge, and one most prominent area is cluster analysis, and he has developed and implemented the network cluster approach, which emphasizes the homophilic echo chambers that users form as they freely interact with one another. So today, Dr. Himelboim will introduce this approach to us. And I would also like to encourage our audience to, if you have any questions, just feel free to ask Dr. Himelboim at the end of the very end of the lecture, and we would have around 5 or 10 minute Q&A section. So Dr. Himelboim, welcome.
Oh, good morning, everybody, and great. Finally, I'm seeing your face. We'll be working along with emails and everything, so it's nice to finally see you. Thank you for inviting me. Hi, everybody. There are many of you I can see here. It's a big class. I'm so happy to have you all here. Let me. So I'm saying social media conversation via clusters in social network. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here this morning. This is he and me, and this is the C-suite. Thank you for the very kind and warm introduction. Much appreciated. I also, yes, so everything you talked about, and I'm also study patterns of social interconnections, information flow, and key communication in health and crisis conversations. So here's what I'm trying to think. So if you're trying to think about probably every research project in social science you were ever involved in, the unit of analysis, the core, what you started and ended with was a user, okay? So if you do a survey or an experiment or even ethnography, ultimately you study individuals. You really go ahead and when you describe the individual, describe them in terms of their average or breakdown of characteristics. On average, the attitude of man is 1.3 higher or lower than a woman in attitude towards risk associated with COVID-19. Our group broke down to 23% men and 43% women, and unknown the rest. So we kind of train to learn to talk about users in this way, to do studies in describing individuals. What network analysis does, it's shifting the focus from the user to the individual to relationship between users. So who asked whom for help? Who retweet whom? Who liked whom on social media? All the way to networks of drug use in health communication, who exchange needles with, and so on. It's always we shifted to the relationship. Which when you think about it, when you think about social media and communication in general, we're shifting the focus from the individual to the communication, which should not sound that when considering we're studying mass communication or individual communication. So we're looking for relationships, and we're looking for patterns of social relationships. And when we talk about cluster in a little bit, but it really falls in the larger world of network science that exists with us for probably almost 100 years. So social network did not start with social media. We had social network for many, many, many years before social media. But one thing was really interesting and fascinating happening with social media. Finally, we were able to analyze large human social networks. We couldn't do it before. All the networks are small, like a classroom or a school or a workplace. Suddenly have really large networks to analyze, similar to what people have doing in computer science, psychology, and so on. One thing so any group of people, online or offline, connected in any form of relationship, as long as the group large enough, we find two common structures. Number one is the small world theory. If you probably, some of you heard about the 6 degrees of separation. Anyone? Okay. Great psychologists in the 1960s, ethics aside, that did many of the studies that you probably learned about, especially if you ever taken introduction to introduction to psychology. I putting the same ethic aside, not because it should be side, but because he raised a lot of ethical issues in his studies, but that's from a whole different lecture. But he did then one interesting study related to how close we are to other people. He asked people to give a group of people in the East Coast packages and say, hey, this is a one person in the West Coast. That's their address. If you don't know them in person, and you probably don't, I want you to mail this package to someone that you think will be closer to that individual in the West Coast, with a note that says the exact same thing. If you know that person, say it directly. If no, pass it to someone that you think is more likely to know them. The United States, about 250 million people back in the 1960s. And that's so they're surprised that the package took on average 6 passes, 6 times it was mailed till they actually reached the person in the West Coast, which was a big story because they're like, hey, how is that possible? 250 million people and only 6 steps, 6 degrees of separation? Well, originally they thought that it's just exponentially me, my friends, just the numbers gets larger. So I'm reaching in 6 steps 250 million people. Like many explanations that make sense, this one was wrong. And what we found out, because my friends and friends tends to be my friends as well. Think about anyone in your classroom, in your students' clubs, in any other activities you participate in. Your friends of friends are also friends. Now, and that was the emergence of clusters. When we freely interact with one another, we tend to create these groups of people that interact with one another more than when we interact with groups, other groups. Think about if you are in a relations or health communication club in your school. In this club, everybody knows everybody. But there's another health communication club in another school in China. Only few of you will know someone in that club. You'll be the people connecting across the clusters. People that sit in the middle, connecting these groups that otherwise are not connected, have power. Because consider bridges, because without them, information would not flow from one group to the other. If one group has a problem, these two people in the middle can choose whether to pass the solution to another group with the same problem or not. These weeks across groups tends to be weak. I mean, you don't really know everybody. You don't need to know them very well. They're in a different university on the other side of the continent. But they pass to you very important information that people in your group cannot. Hence the strengths of weak ties. And I throw in a few citations. We're not going to dive into the theory too much, but just as a reference to you. Another interesting happens. So everybody who's ever taken introduction to statistics knows that everybody talks all the time about the normal distribution. Remember, normal distribution, bell curve. Few have very low values, few have very high values. Most people in the center, around the mean. Remember, introduction to psychology. Like many things that happens in introduction to psychology, they don't really happen in real life. And what we find out that the distribution of attention is very skewed. A lot of people, very few connections, and many people have a lot of connections. So, and a few people have a lot of connection. Few has a lot of few. It means that highly connected users will show up. So the question is not, do I have hubs? But who are the hub, where they're located, what they're doing, what their characteristics, but they will be there. This one actually follows a specific statistical formula called the power law degree distribution that we know since the 1950s. And when people ask, hey, why does that happen? The reason is that even if it starts, at some point it was normal in the beginning, as the network grows, people prefer connecting to the more connected people. So, everybody wants to be friends with the most popular kid in school. So if someone already has more friends in school, everybody wants to be their friends. So their number of friends will grow much more than people have few connections. Hence, the preferential attachment. We prefer connecting to those who are much less connected. So the idea that social context provide context from the conversation. So if you want, you can think about social, think about content in context. You don't just read everything that people say and just describe it. You think about this context, and you think about this content in the social context in which it was communicated. Any questions so far? Because this is the foundation for the rest of the hour. I know your professor told you to wait till the end of the semester, to the end of the presentation, and I love that you listen to him. Let's continue. Social networking cluster, a new way to approach audience. The reason I think about turning it a new way to approach audience, because again, traditionally, you think about audience in a very, old way if you want. You describe them in terms of averages and breakdowns, and you segment them, you break them into groups by things like gender, social demographic, like gender, race and ethnicity, age groups, location, and so on. What we suggest doing here is like all that is important, but let people break themselves into groups. Let's how they naturally break into groups, and then see what I characterize each of these segments. And that is a new way to approach audience. So I'll start working with Twitter networks, not because the Twitter is the most important network, it is not, but it is the most intuitive network to understand in terms of information flow. So I always like to start with Twitter here. So if two Twitter users and are connected to one another, if someone mentioned, retweet, or reply, correct? Therefore, we talk about self-selected patterns of attention giving or receiving, and we look at patterns of information flow. Let's think about that for a second. If I retweet you, everything that you said goes to all my followers. And I'm using Twitter here, but my understanding that Weibo is pretty much the same, right? Which is the equivalent? Remind me the similarities? Yes, no? Is Weibo similar in terms of its patterns to Twitter? Yes, thank you. And that's the idea. The reason I don't get the Weibo data, I do get the Twitter data, so that's more research about that. But it's the same idea. If I'm connected, so in terms of, it's not only patterns of attention giving and receiving, it is also capture of patterns of information flow. If you want to say information flows, if we define a relationship as retweets or follow, we understand information flow. When you think about large social media, that's what you think about. People talk with one another and exchange opinion, exchange of ideas, and interact with one another. When in fact, we create silos. We have groups of people that talk with one another and don't talk with anyone else. Hardly talk with anyone else. Obviously not completely disconnected, but much less connected. So information, rather than really exchange between everybody in the network, it kind of stays within each communities with very little interactions between them. And that will happen. If the network is large enough, cluster will emerge. It doesn't matter if you talk about networks of online networks, offline networks, human networks, animal networks, brain networks of genes in your body, neurons in your brain, you name it, clusters will happen. The question would be how connected or separated they are, because the more connected they are, the less meaningful they are as silos, and the more separated they are, the more we can think about as individual communities or silos of information flow. And you have some metrics for that. So the idea we think about to segment audience, not in terms of how we break the audience into groups, but a self-selected audience segmentation. Some theories. Homophily is one of the early theories that describes why people, what happens when people interact with one another. They tend to choose to interact with those who are similar to them. We have studies already almost 100 years ago that suggest that people will choose to talk or interact any way to say hi in the street to getting married, all strengths of relationships based on a wide range of similarities, from how look the same, political opinions, and almost any characteristic that you imagine. Later on came the feminizing, the birds of a feather flock together, which suggests that similar people interact with one another. But the other side of the coin from communication, or mass communication, if you want, standpoint, is a selective exposure. People choose to listen to information sources that they agree with over information sources that disagree with. But we also know that within clusters, we see strong connections, but redundant. If I don't get information from you, I'm going to get it from someone else, because we also interconnected. We see higher trust and information exchange within clusters, more increased information flow, and faster information spread on Twitter and Dig. Within, we see much faster. Everything gets much slower and weaker across clusters. So, what are we talking about? We run cluster algorithm that sounds fast, complicated, but it's actually not that hard. You don't actually look for them yourself. You run an algorithm to find them, which we think about each cluster, if it's separated enough, it's information silos. Community hub, we're going to look at the top in the grid, the people that had the most connection directed toward them in each group. We think about the people that connect the clusters, which is between us in network analysis. And we find the social mediators, which are the people that connect these clusters and have high connection within their home clusters. We can also look a little bit indeed, not only on who passes the information across cluster, but what information crosses clusters. Because even if I'm a social mediator, I'm bridging these clusters, it really does not mean that everything that comes to me, I'm passing along. I'm being selective. I choose what information to pass across clusters. And what we're going to do between now till the end of the presentation is show you several examples of that, a wide range of platforms and domains. Okie dokie. Let's start with health communication, because that's the topic of this class. So, hey, sounds like a good idea, right? So, we studied the topic about HPV vaccination. At least in the States, the issue of HPV vaccination was more than health, it's become politics. Simply because there were like people objecting the idea of vaccination in general and HPV vaccination in specific. So I was asked to talk with the CDC, which is the Center for Disease and Disease Centers for Disease Controls in Atlanta, conference about vaccination. So I said, hey, what can we do that would be interesting? And I just collected the conversation on HPV vaccination. I went clustering algorithm, identifying the communities. In each community, I'm trying to give it as much information as I can. I look at the top hyperlinks, where people send information to, top domains, what website they go to, what hashtags they're using, what keywords, and so on. So notice that rather than do that, this analysis is kind of, you're familiar with that. But notice that rather than do it in the entire data set and aggregate it, I did it on each of these clusters. And let's see what happens. Okay, so We remember the clusters that we talk about, they are real. This is each of these clusters. So how do we read networks? Let's start with that. Each dot here, you see each dot, each circle, is a user who posted a tweet about HPV vaccination. Each line, if you look close, it's actually an arrow, suggests that this person retweeting, mention, or reply relationship between users. I gave attention to that post, to this user. Each cluster is a group of people that interact with one another more than they interact with others. And we just give different color to each cluster, so it's easy and nice. Also, we are using the highlight in each cluster, the person that has the highest individual, the highest number of attention, reply, mention, retweet, giving to them within each cluster. But they also play a high betweenness role. They also have more connections with people outside their cluster. So far, so good. Let's just take a second and just look at it. And then I'll take it forward, because if it's the very first time you saw a network, it takes a little time to grasp it. So I'll take a few seconds, read it, look at it, and I'll continue. And I can drink my green tea. Okay, now let's look at it for a second and find out that we have different types of communities here. And our goal when we apply is to really understand what makes each community unique. I would say that down the road, I started running automated content analysis on each of these clusters, but it's the very basic. I want to know who leads the conversation. So here's the New York Times, and you can see a very unique structure. Everybody retweet the New York Times. They don't interact with one another. You see there are no lines at the edges. These people do not interact with one another, which shouldn't be a surprise. They don't really have much in common except for following the newspaper. However, if you start going to look at this class, it's much more dense, much more interconnected, and it's around one blogger called It's Me Panda One, and they are objecting everything related to vaccination, so anti-vaccination blogger. And we suggest that this group will probably be anti-vaccination, but we don't know that just yet. We'll continue. This group follow government, the National Science Institution, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. This one just follow news, talk about news in general. It's called Science Alert, and they just share news about science that comes out. This one is a person that talks about homeopathy, like alternative access to traditional medicine. It's called Lotus Oak. Who else? Oh, this one here is an interesting one. These are two like forums where people come and talk about vaccination. They don't necessarily have a strong opinion pro and against. We don't know that, but they have questions. They don't object vaccination per se, but they have concerns. And if something we learned during the pandemic is that, well, people have concerns and they want to talk about it. So and these are two forums that discuss, websites that discuss vaccination. And this one, I had no idea. And that's a fun thing. He was like, who is Dr. Christian? Apparently he's a British TV personality that talks about health issues. So we learned something new. So what do we know so far? We have different groups and they follow different people. What I did next, I dived into each of these clusters And I looked at the top links, top hyperlinks, and we found out that where people post hyperlinks to is dramatically different across clusters. Within the anti-vaccination cluster, links go to anti-vaccination links. So vaccine impact, videos that talk about people regretting getting vaccination, and website that talks about issues related to side effects of vaccination. Notice that you don't find a major news website here, no government website, just individual website that post content against vaccination. Now notice what happened. I'm shifting from this cluster to this cluster. Suddenly, the top hyperlink changes dramatically. News websites, news alerts, overall support and objective coverage of HPV vaccination. Now I'm shifting again. Shifting to the government, the CDC, and you see primarily links to videos related to the government website called helpfinders.gov, and the National Institute of Health website about academic articles about HPV. Now let's go one step back and imagine what would have happened if we didn't take a network approach. We'll find out that the people using, looking at many websites and links to pro-vaccination, anti-vaccination, news, government, blogs, reliable sources, unreliable sources, true, accurate information, misinformation. If you look at all, you're gonna just say, hey, people look for information about HPV vaccination in a wide range of sources, which is nice, you know. People just look in all kinds of sources. They expose themselves to wide opinions and ideas. But only when you apply network analysis and cluster analysis specifically, you say, not exactly. Different groups of people limit their exposure to different types of information. If you already against vaccination, you will only go to websites that support your opinion. If you already support that, you will expose yourself to more news-related and more accurate information. So far, so good. I'm being conscious of time, but I will try to give you a couple of more examples just to show you it always happens, kinda. So let's look a little bit about brand communities and the idea of political communication. So, as you know, the political communication and in this United States, it's very polarized. We have right and left, conservative and liberal. They don't really like to talk with one another. And the reason I like to take this example, which is actually from almost 10 years ago, is because we started thinking about polarization with the 2000 election with Trump, and later on for sure into 2020, but it actually been around quite longer than that. So if we go back to the information in the State of the Union that Obama gave in 2012 and look at the conversation, we can see that conservatives talk with conservatives and liberal talks with liberals. Conservatives link to conservatives' website, liberal links to liberal websites. Conservatives links primarily to conservative bloggers, liberal link to liberal organizations, and also more to news. And there was a lot of conversation in the United States about how people on the conservative side of the political spectrum do not trust traditional media, like mainstream media. And when we do the network analysis, we see that they actually don't follow them. The hubs here are not mass media. The hubs here is mass media. Another interesting thing we found, and we find it quite a lot after that, that you find higher density in conservative clusters and higher centralization, that people follow main information sources on liberal clusters. That means that information and misinformation will flow much more quickly in denser communities than less dense communities. We talked about a lot of links within and a little across. It's nice visually, you can see it, but if you break it down by numbers, you would see, we look at over 3 days, there were like 60% of the links happen within one cluster, 35% in the other, and about 2% between, to show how disconnected, how much information stay within and doesn't cross. Take other political conversations around, even if you said political conversation about progressive or liberal, you see liberal and conservatives. You just see them anywhere you go. And again, I don't remember, did I ever share with you our Pew report that we did a few years back? If not, and if you need, I can share that with you. It's a really easy way to get into network analysis in a way that everybody can understand. Okie dokie. National and cluster. The clusters are not always about politics. So when we look on local elections with national repercussions in the States, we can find out we have one cluster which is about local user talk, and another cluster is about national users outside that state talking about the same election. So there's a local perspective and a national perspective. This one is, I like this thing, this pie here, because it just reminds us all that since social media, the traditional information sources, hence government and news media, now compete with anyone, compete with politicians, compete with local, compete with international, compete with bloggers. Everybody can share information. It's especially important for health communication because not every piece of information that is shared is accurate. I like this one just as a graph. We also did a little study back in the day saying, hey, so we know that people interact with one another based on their similar opinions and attitudes. We also find that people prefer interacting with people that express the same emotions as they are. So happy people express positive content, want to interact with one another more than people that express, and people that express negative content talk with one another. So if you want, shiny happy people tweet together, which was the name of the article I wanted to give it to this article, but the reviewer hated it, so I had to give it a really boring name called Valence-Based Homophily in Political Communication. So what happens if you are an organization that try, how this approach helps you if you're an organization that try to reach people that talk about an issue that is relevant to you. This is, in this case, is just the State Department, but this graph really captures every organization. So if you're an organization and you have an active social media account, you will see a cluster around you, the people that follow you, like your friends, and they retweet you, they share the information. They are the audience that always listen to you. Okay? However, these other groups of people that talk about you, but they don't talk with you. So if you are the State Department, they'll talk about the State Department, but they're not going to talk to the State Department by replying or retweeting or mentioning them. And your goal is to reach out to organizations that are, they talk, what they say is relevant to you. You want them to hear your voice, but most of them don't follow you. What do? We're looking for these social mediators. We are looking for these people that connect my cluster with other clusters that are relevant to me. What did we find out? In the case of the State Department, cluster kind of broke down nicely by areas in the world, from East Asia to Europe to Middle East and North Africa to North America to Oceania, South America, South Asia, and so on. And notice, so we broke down this, we identified the social mediators, and then we ask yourself, okay, who they are. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the government agencies in these areas in the world, like embassies, would retweet and share the information coming from the State Department in Washington, D.C. And that was true for all areas in the world except for the Middle East and North Africa. We see much less use of the social mediators. The bridges are much less government and more individuals and bloggers, which is useful because it means that when you want to evaluate the activity of the organization, you can trust your local government agencies in most of the world to pass the information, except for the Middle East and North Africa. Here you need to find out who are these people who share the information with you, what kind of information do they share with you, and how can you build relationship with them so they're going to continue and bridge the relationship between local communities and the organization. I will want to jump in the purse of time. I'm going to jump through this one, and I want to go to one corporate communication, a little bit about what happens in the world of corporate communication. So I spent a few years back a nice 10 days in New York City, sitting with the research and marketing team of IBM, which was, by the way, a really nice program because they took advertising professors and they put them with advertising teams so we can actually pass this information to our students. Great program, loved it very much. So what happens with IBM is interesting because they were asked from the early days of social media, when only blogs were around, to just have a blog and really encouraged. And they called it the IBMers. However, when social media became very popular, it has become an issue because everybody had official IBM accounts. Now, what do you do with that? It's really hard to keep some consistent messaging when everybody represents the organization. So first I mapped it and I tried to evaluate a little what happened. An interesting thing happened. This here is the official IBM account. See, the main account. This is the clusters with all the IBMers tweeting. So you see a gap between the official conversation coming from IBM to the employees posting in behalf of the organization. Another thing they ask yourself, so if you want to be efficient in communicating with people who are not directly follow your organization, I want to find you in other clusters. Because think about it, you really evaluate social media by number of retweets, likes, shares, you name it, right? But you never ask how homogenic. Do I actually reach to anyone outside? Because think about it, if you are the vice president of a big organization, corporation, If you tweet, everybody in the organization retweet you because, you know, you're the VP and you want to be nice and they like you, or they don't like you, but they want to be nice to you, okay? That meaning that when you tweet, the same people kind of hear your voice because it stays within a cluster. So I was looking to see, can we find people who work for IBM, tweet for IBM, but their account was classified within a different clusters. And you see these two people in green here, a senior VP and another high person. They both existed in different clusters, meaning that when they post about IBM, they reach to a different audience than the other cluster. You see that? So we started to say, okay, what happened in each cluster? One cluster just talk about, that's the most hyperlinks. So one primarily goes to roadmap to success and some official activity associated with IBM. Our cluster here is everybody that love infographics, okay? Hyperlinks primarily share to infographics. That means they give you an idea. Do you want to communicate with clusters? Talk with them in their own language. And people here is all, and the official IBM is all about pushing their Think Leaders program. I did something else. I look at the top hashtags. They all have hashtag AI, artificial intelligence. That's what IBM is doing this day. Not that unique. But this one that talks about Watson and Internet of Things and iClouds and big data. This one got very technical. Machine learning, blockchain, deep learning. This is what this community cares about. And this conversation talks about leadership programs and partnership programs and things which are mattered to IBM at the big pictures. So that's what allows us to evaluate is like, hey, if you want to communicate with people in their own communities, you need to know what they talk about, whether it's health, politics, or corporate communication. Network analysis and clustering approach allows you to identify clusters, identify what makes them unique, and then be able to reach out to them in their own terms. And that's it. Hello. Time? Yes, I think kind of.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Himelboim, for your presentation. Yeah, I'm extremely impressed by the visualizations that you demonstrated, the abundant information from the graphs and the pictures. And I really believe that this kind of research methodologies like cluster analysis is the future of communication research. And I think, I have read many of your research articles, and that is using.
We wrote some of them together.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, thank you. I think we have like 10 minutes remaining. So our audiences, our students, do you have any questions? You can simply unmute yourself and ask Dr. Himelboim. Do you have any questions? Or you can also text your question on the chat. I can read your question on your behalf.
Hello, Professor.
Hey.
Thanks for your academic sharing. I am a student from the University of China, majoring in statistics and minor in communication. I feel a little confused about measures to deal with this phenomenon. As you mentioned, users can form homophilics, echo chambers, and emergent virus clusters. So how can we make professional information exposed to a certain cluster receiving wrong health information? You mentioned we can find a node which has higher between the centrality, but is it a platform for information exchange or a channel for information transmission? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. So there's the how and the what in it. In terms of the how, I just want to make as a side note, I use a program called Node Excel that I teach not only graduate students, undergrad students. It's very easy to work with. You have the data. They're really good handouts and videos that helps you how to do that. It's a good book. So I don't want you to be threatened by the pretty graphs. Anyone can do it. I have 150 undergrad students every year doing it themselves. It's not hard. I'm teaching workshops about it all the time. I just want to put that aside. You can do it. And then again down here, ask me, ask me, how is it useful for misinformation flow? In general, you try to think about, I like to think about different clusters, a cluster that I can become part of and maybe provide this information, and cluster that are so out there in terms of the conspiracy theories that nothing will convince them. So if we go back to the health communication clusters in HPV vaccination, I would not really try to engage with the strong anti-vaccination platform, especially if I'm anything official, like government and so on. Any part you interact with them will give them just more legitimacy. Oh, the government is talking out. We must say something true. I would like to go to find this cluster, and there are many more of those that try to ascertain whether the information is accurate or not. Try to find out, really, they have concerns. They're not sure what the information is. They're not sure what's accurate. They have questions. And this is where the kind of groups that you want to kind of reach out to by identify the sources and the main sources and this bridging hub, this mediated. Regardless, you want to know two things. Number one, what is overall the miscommunication? What is miscommunication about? Where it's coming from? And more importantly, and I think that also is related to one of the articles we did together, is that what misinformation is more popular than other? Because remember the skew distribution, few gets a lot gets few. That's true for everything on social media. There are probably a lot of misinformation there, but you really care about this misinformation that is being shared a lot, discussed a lot. So really looking at this data, let's identify which misinformation is more problem than another, where it's coming from, what's in it. And then, even without interacting with them on their own kind of conspiracy cluster, you can create messaging that can be reached out, post on your own account, or engage with influential users within clusters that are around related to people who have questions and concern, but they're not deep into the misinformation conspiracy world. Does that answer your question, Hongjun?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks for replying. Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you, Itai, for your response. Anybody else? Any other questions? I guess you can simply unmute and directly ask your question. I think our students might have to grasp a little bit. And
no, I'm familiar with having a guest speaker in my class and nobody wants to speak. It's the students. I'm very familiar with that. I would just say I want you to all keep this approach in mind to your research and really know that you can do that. I mean, the hard part of it is really not to run the analysis. If you Google Node Excel, even put it on YouTube. There's a lot of ways that you can easily do it. There's a book, there's a handout, there's tutorials. The hard part is creating the conceptual framework that fits your analysis and making the interpretation. But the analysis itself is pretty straightforward. What it means is the how part for you as researchers. Someone share the file.
I think it's irrelevant to it. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, actually, I have a question regarding the, which is not that methodological, but it's more, sociological. I noticed that some sociology scholars seem to be quite optimistic about the role of weak ties in social media platforms.
Right.
Yeah, the weak ties, and particularly their role in facilitating the free flow of communication, the free flow of information, which also enables heterogeneous networks. But some are also very worried about the dark side of the weak ties. Even we have a lot of weak ties on social media platforms, it does not necessarily lead to like the e-democracy, which is ideal, nor do they break the echo chambers. So it might instead intensify the homophily. So based on your research, what role do you think these kind of social media weak ties really play in the social media world, especially in the Twitter sphere? Yeah.
Yes, and it's anyway. So that's a wonderful question. It also requires a little bit of fine-tuning of the conceptualization of weak ties. So So the original literature was done outside. It's back in the 1970s, 80s. Governor did these studies on the strengths of weak ties. On social media, so a couple of things. First, on social media, relationship tends to be weaker in general. But we can talk about stronger and weaker ties. So social media relationships do not, especially in this network, don't need to be like bond relationship, I will die for you kind of relationships, but they're stronger in terms of trust and information flow. The other thing to keep in mind is that not every weak tie is a bridge, but bridges tend to be a weak tie. So if you find that a relationship is weak on social media, it doesn't by itself make them bridging ties. But if you find the bridging relationship between clusters, these tend to be weaker for the reason that we discussed. So to your question, I would come for that from the network kind of structure, and then identify the strengths of this relationship. And we come from this approach, then you can ask yourself, okay, what happened in the clusters? If two clusters are misinformation, yeah, the weak tie between them will pass misinformation from one to the other. But if one tie is misinformation, one tie is accurate information, then it's interesting to see what happens between them. So first, identify what each cluster is about, and that will really get to understand what weak ties are who and what information flows against them. And this is correct that it's hard to convince people when it's come to so these missing, and then comes with the word misinformation. So if it's disinformation, it's kind of that's with more purpose in it. You really want to give out information this is accurate to sway opinions or malinformation. When it's misinformation, just inaccurate information, it can be more of easier and welcoming conversation to corrections. So it's really the kind of information, the kind of clusters, and what connects them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, I think another question is related to some traditional communication theories. I was pretty impressed by the very first graph that you demonstrated, the one that includes like the New York Times as a center of a cluster. So it seems to me that every cluster is so different, like the nodes and the edges. The nodes that are connected by the edges and the patterns of the nodes and edges are quite different. So do you think that some traditional communication theories like two-step flow have totally been like, changed? That kind of theory is not, does not have a better explanatory power in the current social media sphere, or are they still valid? How do you think?
This is an excellent communication. Fred, the two-step theory is a network theory. Never call it that way. It is a network theory. So I think the two-step theory is pretty straightforward to explain, especially the criticism over the last, 6 years. The two-step theory was that it was too simple. Media, opinion leaders, public. They talking about and actually, I love this example because when you look at the literature about two-step theory, the kind of criticism and develop over the years, pretty much adding more relationships and direction. So they made it a network over time because they say, oh, but what about information from the audience to opinion leaders? What about the information flow from media directly to the audience, not mediated by opinion leader? They think about what is it always one step flow or the two steps? So by its core, if it wasn't a network theory, it has become a network theory. That said, almost every communication theory, and that's something that I really enjoy. So when we write a literature review for these studies, there are two approaches. One is to come from network theories, and the other is really show how the key concepts of communication theories can be first conceptualized in terms of networks. So public relation talks about a lot about theories about building relationship between companies and audiences. This is a link that we can conceptualize in terms of network analysis. There's a lot of brand communities literature talks about community of brands. Cluster is a community. So what we do, we start with the literature and the key concepts that everybody knows from this theory, and then go and show how each of these concepts can be seen as a network structure, a network concept. What does a cluster mean? What density mean? What centralization mean? What integrate? What bridge? What's all these network methods actually correspond quite nicely to theoretic existing communication theory, just needed to waiting for someone like you all this connection in the literature review, and really not only provide more findings, but also provide enhance existing theoretical frameworks. So yes, to your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That makes great sense. Yeah, I think we're on time. Thanks so much, Dr. Itai Himelboim, for your lecture today. And I think our students might take more time to grasp. And yeah, I think we have your email address on our poster, on our
please go ahead, send me emails.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, you can send emails to Dr. Himelboim for any questions that related to today's lecture. Yeah. So thank you again, Itai. Thanks for the wonderful lecture you delivered. Yeah.
Staying so late.
Yeah, it's pretty early in your place, right?
Okay. 8 o'clock you can handle.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And great seeing you again. And thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.